The Height of the Ridiculous by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Standard 10th, English. Let's know a little about the poet. Oliver Wendell Holmes was born on 29th August 1809. He was born in Cambridge in the United States. His father was a minister for the First Congregational Church and he also loved history. 1813 was the year Oliver Wendell Holmes started writing his poetry. He wrote more than 50 poems during the year, and four of them would become some of his best known, including The Dorchester Giant, Evening by a Tailor, Reflections of a Proud Pedestrian, and The Height of the Ridiculous. Oliver Wendell Holmes was well respected and liked by his peers. Many of his papers, essays, and poems are in the library at the Phillips Academy in Andover, where Holmes studied. Oliver Wendell Holmes had a long life and wrote for most of his years. He penned poetry, essays, books, and other papers while studying and practicing medicine, many of which became very well known and gave him an international following. The Height of the Ridiculous is by Oliver Wendell Holmes and is a humorous poem written for enjoyment with plenty of funny expressions. The main purpose of the poet is simply entertain his audience. The Height of the Ridiculous by Oliver Wendell Holmes. I wrote some lines once on a time in wondrous merry mood, and thought, as usual, men would say they were exceeding good. They were so queer, so very queer, I laughed as I would die. Albeit, in the general way, a sober man am I. I called my servant, and he came. How kind it was of him to mind a slender man like me, he of the mighty limb. These to the printer, I exclaimed, and in my humorous way I added, as a trifling jest, there'll be the devil to pay. He took the paper and I watched, and saw him peep within. At the first line he read, his face was all upon the grin. He read the next, the grin grew broad, and shot from ear to ear. He read the third. A chuckling noise I now began to hear. The fourth, he broke into a roar. The fifth, his waistband split. The sixth, he burst 5 buttons off and tumbled in a fit. 10 days and nights with sleepless eye I watched that wretched man, and since I never dare to write as funny as I can. I wrote some lines once on a time in wondrous merry mood, and thought, as usual, men would say they were exceeding good. Here the poet says that when the poet was in a delightful mood, he wrote some lines and he assumed that the people would appreciate his writing because he thought that people will say that they were so good. They were so queer, so very queer. I laughed as I would die, albeit in the general way, a sober man am I. Here the line that the poet wrote according to him were very queer, that is, it was very strange and funny. Although the poet considered himself as a man of serious disposition, he thought himself to be a sober man. He thought that while reading these lines he would die due to fits of laughter. Here he is exaggerating the statement to show that the lines he wrote were so very funny. I called my servant and he came. How kind it was of him to mind a slender man like me. He was the mighty limb. Here the poet says that he called his servant, and the poet says that it was very kind of that man, that is his servant, who was a very strong willed person, to look after and take orders from a thin and not so strong person like the poet. Now, what orders did the poet make to the servant? We will see in the next paragraph. These to the printer I exclaimed, and in my humorous way I added, as a trifling jest, there'll be the devil to pay. Here the poet has ordered his servant to take those sheets of paper on which the poet has written the poem to the printer to publish. The poet says as a trifling jest means he says jokingly that there will be a devil to pay means there will be a serious trouble resulting from publishing his poem means that there will be some strong reactions perhaps. He took the paper and I watched and saw him peep within. At the first line he read, his face was all upon the grin. Here the poet says that the servant took the paper and the poet was curious to know his reaction. So the poet watched the servant. The poet saw that the servant was curious to know what is written in those papers. So the servant peeped within. He read the text. So after reading the first line, there was a grin, that is, there was a smile on the face of the servant. He read the next. The grin grew broad and shot from ear to ear. He read the third, a chuckling noise I now began to hear. Here the poet says that as he read the second line, the grin, that is, the smile of the servant, grew even more wider. So later, when the servant read the third line, the poet heard the servant was laughing quietly. That was a chuckling noise was made. And so the poet could hear all of it. The fourth, he broke into a roar. The fifth, his waistband split. The sixth, he burst 5 buttons off and tumbled in a fit. Here, now when the servant reached the fourth line, he broke into a roar. That is, he started roaring with laughter. So, on reading each line, if you see, the servant's laughter changes its form uncontrollably. Now, when he reached the fifth line, the servant laughed so much that his waistband splits. So, this is a type of imagery. When you read this, you can imagine a person who is very strongly built and that and he starts laughing and his waistband splits. So, it's kind of funny. Now, while reading the sixth line, he was not able to manage his emotions and went into fits of laughter, and his buttons snapped, and he was rolling on the floor laughingly. He tumbled in a fit. 10 days and nights with sleepless eye I watched that wretched man, and since I never dare to write as funny as I can. So now the poet watched that wretched man. His condition was so wretched, that is, pitiful, that he watched that man for 10 days and nights without sleeping. So in the last line, the poet says that after he saw his servant has gone through so much, he concluding making a decision that after this he wouldn't dare to write any more funny or humorous poems. Now, here in this poem, we have seen some new words. Let us know its meanings. Ridiculous means too funny to believe. Merry means cheerful and lively. Exceeding means be greater in number or size than. Queer means strange, odd. Albeit means though. Sober means clear headed or serious. Slender means slim or lean. Trifling jest means a small simple joke of no importance. Grin means smile broadly. Chuckling means laugh quietly. Tumble means having fallen or collapsed. Wretched means in a very unhappy or unfortunate state. There'll be the devil to pay means there will be a huge amount of trouble. Let's know a small appreciation of this poem. The poem The Height of Ridiculous is by Oliver Wendell Holmes. The rhyme scheme of the poem is ABCB. There are many figures of speech like hyperbole, onomatopoeia, tautology, alliteration, etc., but the one that stands out is transferred epithet. In the line 10 days and nights with sleepless eye, the adjective sleepless should be for the man and not for the eye. The poem is a humorous one written for enjoyment with plenty of funny expressions. The main purpose of the poet is to simply entertain the reader.